Okay, we're continuing with our study on Romans. Brother Chad asked me this morning how much longer he thought this would go, and I told him I think a year, and he said another year, and I said no, I think the whole thing will wrap up in about a year. So we're at lesson number 32, I think 32, 33, one of those two, 32. And today we're beginning with chapter 11. Take a few weeks to get through 11, and then we get into some practical teaching. Well, once we finish chapter 11, then we finish the doctrinal teaching in Romans, and then we start getting into practical teaching and how do we live? What do we do? How do we? Which will be kind of a nice change after this much doctrine that we've been dealing with since, for now 11 chapters. We finally start getting into how we function in this life, or how we should. Now in Romans chapter 9, we were introduced with the idea that there are two Israels, right? There's the natural nation of Israel, those that come of the lineage of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that within that natural national Israel, there is a spiritual portion which are God's elect children. Okay, we were introduced with that in chapter 9. In chapter 10, we dealt with the fact that one of Paul's great desires was to be able to save that spiritual portion of Israel, understanding that you're not going to save the portion that's not elect. They can't see anyway. They're blind to the gospel anyway, and we're going to cover that a little bit more today, or at least in chapter 11. But it was his desire to try to save some of spiritual Israel. And the salvation that he's referring to, obviously, is temporal salvation. Because they're already eternally saved by reason of the fact that they were elect. Now we come to chapter 11, and it begins with this. I say then, hath God cast away his people? You stop and think about this. Go back to the times of the Apostle Paul. Now, it was still several years before, that Paul wrote this several years before God sent Titus to destroy the temple and disperse the Jews all over the globe. But you could already start to see that the Gentile church was taking off. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. He was out, they had gone to the Jews had rejected the gospel. Now the church is being made up primarily of Gentiles, some Jews, but primarily Gentiles. And so you might ask the question, wait a minute, has God cast his people off? Is he finished with Israel? Look at 1 Samuel chapter 12. First Samuel chapter 12 and verse 22 says, "For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it hath pleased the Lord to make you his people." Now here the Jews were reading this thinking, wait a minute, it looks like he's forsaken us. He said he wouldn't, but it looks like he has. Because now he's got these Gentiles. And we're no longer considered in this church as the nation. The nation was what mattered up until the time of Christ. You couldn't worship God properly if you weren't in the nation of Israel, either by being a proselyte or by being Jewish, and you had to do it at the temple, and you had to follow those. That was the way God's worship service worked back then. Now it's been changed. From the time of Christ, it's been changed to the church. And so here God has talked about not forsaking his people, and yet here it looked like maybe he had. Look at Jeremiah chapter 31. Jeremiah 31 and verse 37 says, "Thus saith the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth searched out beneath, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all that they have done." Well, but you can't measure heaven. So you see, this is the same. I mean, if you can do this, well, then I'll cast them off. That's kind of like saying, I'm not gonna. And yet, they're wondering, has he? And that's the question that Paul's asking here in verse 11. "I say then, hath God cast away his people?" And he continues by saying, "God forbid." And now he's going to give a reason as to why. I mean, you consider he's dealt at length with national Israel's disobedience. He's remembered that national Israel's been called the people of God in the past, and so he asks this question if they've been cast away. But then he says, "God forbid, for I also am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin." Paul wasn't cast away. He was a Jew. Peter wasn't cast away. He was a Jew. John, the apostles, those that were founding the churches, those that we read about over in the book of Acts that were Jews, they hadn't been cast away. Only a portion of it had been cast away. In fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 22, we read, "Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they of the seed of Abraham? So am I." You see, Paul was a Jew. He hadn't been cast away, so God hadn't cast away all of them. And that's the point he's trying to make. God hadn't cast away all of them. Now look at what he says here. Verse 2, "God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew." He has not cast away his people which he foreknew. That is a direct reference to the elect, not the nation. He hasn't cast away the elect. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 2. "Elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through sanctification of the Spirit unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ." And we've shown over and over and over and over again that foreknowledge is of who the person is, not of what the person does. I don't think we need to go back to that again. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 29, "For whom he did foreknow," there's that foreknowledge. "For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate, to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be in the firstborn among many brethren." And we worked this one over and over and over again when we were dealing with chapter 8, so we don't need to do that again. But you notice that he hasn't cast away the people that he foreknew. He hadn't cast away the elect. Now we're going to see that he did cast away the non-elect, that he's finished with them, finished with them forever. Now, that goes contrary to a lot of Baptist churches. There's a whole bunch of Baptist churches out there that teach to this day that someday he's going to welcome the Jews back in, and he's going to rebuild the temple, and he's going to reinstitute animal sacrifices, and that's why we're supposed to be friendly with Israel. But that's not Bible teaching. That's footnote teaching. That's going into a Schofield Bible and looking at the footnotes and paying more attention to the footnotes than you do to the actual text. The nation of Israel, God finished with them in 70 AD, and as far as that nation is concerned, they're not his Israel anymore. The elect portion of that nation are just like elect Gentiles, with one exception that we'll get to when we get to the end, towards the end of this chapter. There is one thing that he has done to many of those elect, regenerate Jews, and that is that he's blinded them to the gospel. That's one thing that's one of the reasons that they can't see it. You can be talking to an elect, regenerate Jew, and they cannot see the gospel because they've been blinded to it. That's something that he did do to many of them. Some of them can see it, but for the most part, they can't. They can't see any more than an unregenerate person can. And but that's something that applies to them. And we'll see that when we get to it. So he hasn't cast away the Israelites that he foreknew. And Paul cites an event in the life of Elijah to prove that in the nation of Israel, within that nation, there are God's elect. And it has always been this way. I mean, early on, by and large, most of the nation of Israel were God's elect. But the farther it's gone, the less and less of them there were. And by the time we got to Elijah's day, there were just down to a few. I want you to turn over to 1 Kings chapter 19. We're dealing with Elijah. Elijah is feeling like he's the only guy left. Out of this entire nation of Israel, he's the only one left that's standing for God. That's what he actually thought at this point. It was down to that point. And look what he says. And he said, I've been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. I'm the only one left, and the Jews are the ones that are trying to kill me. The very people that claim that they're yours, they're the ones that are hunting me down and trying to kill me. And he said, go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord, and behold, the Lord passed by, and with a great and strong wind rent the mountains and break in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind, and after the wind, an earthquake. I need to get down. And I don't need to get into this whole study. Let's get down to, look at verse 18. Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. The point that I want to make here, and I don't want to get off into Elijah too deeply, but the point that I want to make was that Elijah's interceding against Israel, thinking he's the only one that's left that's faithful to God. And God says, I got 7,000 more. There's 7,000 more that I've got that are mine, that have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even though most of the rest of them had, God knew that there were 7,000. In Elijah's day, there were those 7,000 that God had reserved to himself. He knew where they were. He knew where his people were. He knew they were there. Look at 2 Timothy chapter 2. And this is an important thing to consider. We may not know. We may get down to a point where we think we're the only church left. And yet there might be a church right around the corner. We just don't know about it. But God does. God knows where his people are. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 19. Nevertheless, the foundation of God standeth sure, having this seal, the Lord knoweth them that are his. And let every one that nameth the name of Christ depart from iniquity. The Lord knows where his people are. He knows who they are, even if we don't. Even if we don't see them, he knows where they are. Okay? So, in Romans 11, let's go ahead and read the verse. Verse 2, God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. Wot ye not what the scripture saith of Elias, how he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets and digged down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I've reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so then, at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. Even so then, during the times of Elijah, at this present time also, during the times of the Apostle Paul, there was a remnant according to the election of grace. Elijah was a prophet in the Old Testament. Paul was an apostle of the New Testament. People in Elijah's day were saved exactly the same way that people were saved in Paul's day, the same way that people are saved today. It's based on an election of grace. Back in the Old Testament, that's how God's children were saved. In the New Testament, that's how God's children are saved. It was by grace. And it was through the election that we studied over in Romans chapter 9. They were elected to that. And that election is based on grace. Look at verse 6. And if by grace, then is it no more of works, otherwise grace is no more grace. But if it be of works, then is it no more grace, otherwise work is no more work. It can't be both. It can't be a mixture. You can't take grace and then add works to it. Because if you do, it's not grace. The election is based on grace, on unmerited favor. God chose who he would choose. Whether they were Jew or Gentile made no difference. He chose them all the same way. He chose them all at the same time, before the foundation of the world. So here you have this huge nation of Israel, millions of people, and there were 7,000 of them that were God's children within that nation. And that 7,000 were not cast off, even though the rest of them were. He was finished with them. He was done dealing with them. At the point when Christ came and reformed the worship service from the old Israel into the New Testament church, that national portion of Israel God was finished with. The elect portion he'll never be finished with. They're his children. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, grace. Grace is defined as favor, favorable or benignant regard, or its manifestation now only on the part of a superior. Favor or goodwill in contradistinction to right or obligation as the ground of a concession. And we've used this word many times before because it comes right out of the Bible. God showed mercy on some people. He showed mercy on some people. People that deserved punishment, he let them off the hook. He showed mercy on them. That's grace. A work is something that is or was done, what a person does or did. An election is a matter of God granting man a favor not based on anything that the man does, thinks, wishes, anything else. Romans chapter 9, our proof text for that. Romans chapter 9, verse 11, for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. Election is based on who God calls, and it's based on grace. And Paul is using Elijah as that example. And it's not based on God paying a debt to somebody. If Romans chapter 4, and verse 4 says, to him that worketh is the reward not reckoned of grace, but of debt. If you believe that you have to do something in order to earn the grace of God, then if God gives you the grace of God based on your earning it, then it's a debt, right? Just like if I hire someone to mow my lawn, and then when they're finished mowing the lawn, I pay them, is that grace? Was I just being kind-hearted to give this poor guy some money? No, he earned it. I owed it to him. It was a debt. He did what I told him he had to do in order to earn that, right? So it's a debt. That's the problem with religion, like free will religion or any of the work-based religion. You're obligating God to yourself by doing what you think He said you had to do in order to get the benefit. And so that's not grace, that's debt. Grace is when God comes along and just saves somebody that's not even paying attention at the time. Now, you walk down the street and find some guy and hand him 20 bucks for nothing just because he's there, that's grace. But if he's got to mow the lawn to get it, it's debt. And it's not grace. So many people have the idea that the Bible sets forth the conditions that you have to meet in order for God to give you eternal life. If that's the way it's set up, then you believe that you're indebting God to yourself. That what God is paying you is something that He owes you. And that is not the way it works. He owes you nothing. He owes you nothing other than the fact that if He elected you, He loves you and wants you to benefit. But you didn't do anything to earn this. Don't ever think that it was because I'm so good, because it's not. That's not what the new birth is about. God felt sorry for a bunch of people and decided to save them. He showed mercy on them. And that's what grace is. Now, in the next sections, verses 7 through 10, Paul's going to divide the nation into these two groups, the election and the rest. Okay? Verse 7, what then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Israel, that's national Israel, natural Israel, not spiritual. We're talking about the nation of Israel here. Israel has not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election, that's spiritual Israel. The election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. So national Israel was blinded. You want to know why they couldn't see the gospel? Because they can't see the gospel. They're blind to it. Just like any other unelect person is. Now, what did Israel seek for? What were they looking for? Think about Israel. Think about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. What was it that they were seeking for? What were they searching for? What were all of their religious practices geared towards? Righteousness. They were seeking for righteousness. Just like people that fill up churches today, they're seeking for righteousness. They're not seeking it in the right place, and if they're not elect, they're not going to be able to reach it anyway. But why else do you go to church? People go to church because they want righteousness, right? That's what they were searching for. Look at Romans chapter 9, verses 31 and 32. But Israel, again, we're back to national Israel again, but Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Wherefore? Because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law, for they stumbled at that stumbling stone. As it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. So you have national Israel. You picture the Pharisees that were so very legalistic that if you so much as crossed the line, you were in trouble with them. They came up with all those special rules so that you can be righteous. The problem was their eyes were on man. Their eyes were not on God. They were concerned with appearing righteous before men so that was enough for them. You follow me? There are people that go to church because they want to appear good before other people, not really concerned with what God thinks about them, but they're seeking for this righteousness from the standpoint of people think I'm righteous. People think I'm good. People think I'm just. And that's what they were doing. It was man worship. Okay? But that's what they were seeking, and they did it by trying to follow the law, not by looking at the faith of Jesus Christ as something that's actually going to pay the price for me. They were trying to do it themselves. That's what they sought for, and they didn't attain it, because you can't attain it by the works of the law. But now notice that the elect within the nation have obtained righteousness. Now, how did they obtain it? Those that were blinded to it, those that couldn't see, those that were lost, sought righteousness and couldn't obtain it. How was it that the elect obtained it? Well, they obtained it through the righteousness of Jesus Christ. That's how they obtained it. Someone else obtained it for them, and then it was given to them. Look at Romans chapter 5. Verses 9 through 10. Much more than being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. Look at Hebrews chapter 9. You see, we were justified when we were enemies, not when we were trying to be his friend, not when we were out trying to obtain righteousness by ourselves, by keeping the law. God's children were justified when we were enemies to him, because actually trying to obtain righteousness by keeping the law shows that you're an enemy of him. That's not what gets us there. What gets us there is Jesus Christ. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 12. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. Christ obtained the eternal redemption for all of God's children on the cross and subsequent appearing before God in heaven. Verses 26 and through 28. For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world, but now once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for him shall he appear the second time without sin unto salvation. And in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 14, we read, for by one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. This is how the elect obtained righteousness. It was by the action of Jesus Christ presenting himself as the sacrifice for them. It was his righteousness that was then transferred to them. They didn't obtain it by trying to work their way there by keeping the law. They obtained it through Christ. And then we see, back to Romans, it says, Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. The rest of Israel, the non-elect, were blinded all the way up until the time that Paul was speaking. Okay? And as proof of this blindness, Paul quotes Isaiah 29:10, where he says in verse 8, according as it is written, God hath given them, natural Israel, the spirit of slumber, eyes that they, natural Israel, should not see, and ears that they, natural Israel, should not hear unto this day. Okay, he's quoting there Isaiah chapter 29. And verse 10, for the Lord hath poured out upon you the spirit of deep sleep, and hath closed your eyes, the prophets and your rulers, the seers hath he covered. He'd closed their eyes to it. They could not see the truth. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 9. And he said, go and tell this people, hear ye indeed, but understand not, and see ye indeed, but perceive not. Make the heart of this people fat, and make their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their hearts, and understand with their heart, and convert and be healed. You know, there was a time when the disciples came to Christ, and they asked him, why do you teach in parables? Well, you know, why are you always teaching in parables? And he referred back to that passage and told them, I teach in parables so that seeing they see not and hearing they hear not. I'm teaching this way because they can't understand it anyway, so I'm teaching so that you understand it, but they don't. These Jews were blinded. And that was a judgment that was put upon them for their hypocrisy. Now, David brings up an interesting point. I want you to turn to Psalm chapter 69. Psalm chapter 69, verses 22 through 23. There we go. I started to read Psalm 68, and I thought, well, that doesn't line up. Psalm 69:22, let their table become a snare before them, and that which should have been for their welfare, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened, that they see not, and make their loins continually to shake. This word table, let's go back and see how it is that Paul says this. Verse 9 of chapter 11, and David saith, let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense unto them. Let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back alway. Now remember, we're talking about national Israel, not spiritual at this point. We are talking about natural Israel. This word table, let their table be made a snare, translates the word trapeza, which is a table or a stool, usually for food, but it also carries with it the idea of a counter for money. In other places, you'll find this word translated as bank, as meat, as table. You think about this. There were 2 times when Christ overthrew the tables of the money changers. Remember that? Look first at John chapter 2. Verses 13 through 16. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Look also at Mark chapter 11. verses 15 through 18. And they come to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, Mine house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves? And the scribes and chief priests heard it, and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people was astonished at his doctrine. You say, well, what? I don't get it. What's the money changers thing? Well, in Jerusalem at that time, the Jews had reached the rule that when you come to Jerusalem, from wherever it is that you come, remember, you're supposed to go there 3 times a year. The males are supposed to present themselves at the temple. That's where they pay their tithes. That's where they make their sacrifices. Well, if you live in Long Beach, California, it's going to be hard to take a sheep to Jerusalem, right? So there were people there that would sell you a sheep. You could buy a sheep, or you could buy a dove, or you could buy whatever animal it was that you needed to sacrifice. They had them for sale in the temple, right? Business. The table of the money changers, I think they've changed the airport. At Tampa Airport, it used to be that when you got off the shuttle, if you got off the right shuttle, where you had to get off this way, there was a chapel right there. And then right around the corner from it, in front of the elevators, there was a place where you could exchange your money. So if you flew in from Germany and you had a wallet full of Deutschmarks, you could walk up to that table and give them your Deutschmarks, and they would give you dollars. Okay? That's a money changer. The Jews had come they had made the rule that when you paid your tithe, you had to pay your tithe in temple money. Okay? You couldn't bring dollars. You had to change your dollars into temple currency before you put your tithe in the box. Right? For a fee, of course. Right? So they would set up their exchange rate at whatever it was. So, well, okay, $2, that's going to buy you 1 coin, so you need $4 to come up with. It's business. They were running a business out of the temple. And it was an ungodly business because they were taking advantage of the poor people that were just there trying to do what God told them to do. Okay, that's what these tables were. And that's why Christ overthrew them. Because that's an ungodly practice going on in the house of God. Taking advantage of people this way. You think about it, and I'm going to get myself in trouble here now, but the Jews have always been the foremost in the banking industry in the world. Always have been. They're very good at it. They're very talented at making money. Okay? The problem is that they put the pursuit of earning riches in front of the pursuit of worshiping God. That's how their tables became a snare to them. They became a snare because the pursuit of riches became more important than anything else. Look at, where am I here? Look at Luke chapter, is that right? Yeah, Luke chapter 16. Verses 13 and 14. No servant can serve 2 masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. Ye cannot serve God and mammon. And the Pharisees also, who were covetous, heard all these things, and they derided him I wonder why. Because that's exactly what they were doing. They had chosen money over God. Look at Matthew chapter 22. Verses 1 through 8. And Jesus answered and spake unto them again by parables, and said, The kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king, which made a marriage for his son. And he sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. Again he sent forth other servants, saying, Tell them which are bidden, Behold, I have prepared my dinner, my oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready to come unto the marriage. But they made light of it, and went their ways, one to his farm, another to his merchandise. And the remnant took his servants, and entreated them spitefully, and slew them. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies, and destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. Then said he to his servants, The wedding is ready, but they which were bidden were not worthy. Do you not see old Israel in this? This is a parable of what went on with old Israel. Here God had set this up. He brought them into a land. They never even had to build a house. They come right into it. They were given more blessings than anyone on ever. And what'd they do? They turned their back on God and started serving money. And so God decided to go ahead and cast off that portion that were not elect and be done with them. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. Verses 9 and 10. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare. Remember, let their tables be made a snare unto them. They that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. If God blesses you to be rich, that's fine. But if you decide that money is more important than God, then you're falling into the same category that these Jews did. Okay? And so as a judgment or a recompense, God has turned the non-elect Israelite over to his covetousness. You know, be very careful about what you wish for. Be very careful of what you ask God for. You might get it. And you might find out that's the last thing in the world that you really wanted. Be careful. These people wanted money, so we turned them over to it. Let them have it. Where David had said in Psalm 119:36, Incline my heart unto thy testimonies, and not to covetousness. These Jews had gone full bore into covetousness. You know, the ability to earn money and to get wealth would have been for the benefit of Israel. I mean, think about it. If you have the ability to get wealth, that nation, during the time of Solomon, that was the wealthiest nation on planet Earth. That would have been to their benefit. But not if they used it wrongly. And if they used it wrongly, then God turned them over. Will turn them over to it. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 10 through 18. And this is a warning from Moses to the nation of Israel. When thou hast eaten and art full, then thou shalt bless the Lord thy God for the good land which he hath given thee. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee to do thee good at thy later end. And thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is in this day. So don't lose sight of the fact that if you have the ability to get wealth, it's because God gave you the ability to get wealth. Use it for godly purposes. Don't start thinking it's me. You start thinking it's me, and he can take it away from you just as quickly as he gave it to you. Be very careful. Be thankful to him for it, because if you've got it, it came from him. Don't start thinking that it's all about me. Now, let me make this one other point. This judgment of blindness back in Romans. Verse 10, let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back alway. This judgment of blindness and the bowing down of their back is to be alway. That's a long time. There's no promise that they ever will recover from this. This is always. The non-elect Jews will never be saved. They will never see the truth of the gospel. And God has finished dealing with them. And as of 70 AD, when he wiped them off the planet, that was the end of them. Now, we see that there are other groups that are going to try to make a comeback and make it look like God hasn't finished with them, but in reality, he has. The nation of Israel, as his system of worship in this world, is over with. The church has been reformed, and it will remain a church until the time Christ returns. So whatever you see going on in the news over there in the Middle East, don't get flustered or upset by any of the... If they all of a sudden decide to build a temple, don't worry about it. It's not God building the temple, because he turned these people over to their covetousness and blinded them always. They're done. So whatever they're doing, don't give it a minute's thought. Don't worry about it. Don't get flustered by it. Don't think, oh no, now I got to travel to Israel. That's not the temple that we need to worry about. The temple that's being built is the one in heaven. That's the important one. Look at Psalm chapter 69. Verses 24 through 28, where we're going to see that this further confirms that the judgment upon non-elect Israel is without end. Okay? Pour out thine indignation upon them, and let thy wrathful anger take hold of them. Let their habitation be desolate, and let none dwell in their tents. For they persecute him whom thou hast smitten, and they talk to the grief of those whom thou hast wounded. Add iniquity unto their iniquity, and let them not come into thy righteousness. Let them be blotted out of the book of the living, and not be written with the righteous. It's over, and it's been over. God did cast away that portion of Israel, but not the ones that he foreknew. Okay? Where are we at? I don't know if I can get all the way through this or not. Verses 11 through 15. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Now notice, in verse 10, let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back always. We're talking about national Israel, non-elect Jews, okay? That's the end of national Israel. So there's a change now. In verse 11, we're not talking about national Israel anymore. National Israel ended at the period at the end of verse 10. Now we're back to talking about spiritual Israel. Does that make sense? We've finished national. We are now going back to talk about spiritual again. Okay? So when it says, I say then, have they stumbled, that's not national, that's spiritual. Has spiritual Israel stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. Now picture, you have national Israel, within national Israel you have spiritual Israel, okay? Think with me for a minute. If you grew up as a Jew, like the Apostle Paul, let's look at the Apostle Paul. Look at his background for a bit. When he was a young man, was he a Christian? No. No. He learned religion the same way that all of the other Jews learned religion. Now, he was born again. And there were a whole bunch of other Jews that were born again within the nation of Israel that followed the same teaching that they had learned from their fathers going all the way back. Okay? So if you were Jewish within this nation, what teaching do you have? Are you going to be pro-Christian for the most part? Paul certainly wasn't. He was out killing Christians or standing by their murder because he thought they were wrong. And most of the Jews that grew up at this time, they followed Judaism because what else would you follow? Right? So they're not hearing even if they had the ability to hear the message, they're not listening to it. Just like before your conversion, you weren't listening to it. Okay? So what he's saying is, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall salvation has come to the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. Within national Israel you have a remnant that is spiritual Israel, that are born again people. And all of a sudden they see over here the church. They're antagonistic to the church because they grew up Jews. And they listened to the Pharisees, and they were taught by just like so many people today, they're trapped in false systems of Christianity, are antagonistic to us. They may very well be Christian, but they haven't heard the truth, and they don't want to listen to it because I grew up a Presbyterian and I'm going to die a Presbyterian. And that's just the way it is, right? So try to think of it in that sense when we're looking at these Jews. It's just like folks that grew up in a Catholic church. They're always going to be a Catholic. And they don't want to hear from you because this is the way the Pope said it, and that's the way it is. Even if they're a child of God, they're blinded by their own loyalty to the religion that they grew up in, rather than taking the book out and actually looking at it. So think of it in those terms. That's who Paul's talking about. The only difference is we're not talking about Catholics. We're talking about Jews. Okay? Jews that grew up as Jews, studied Judaism, and even though they're born-again elect Jews, they still aren't looking at the New Testament. They're still trapped in that old system. Does that make sense? Does that help? I hope. And through their stumbling over it, God turned to the Gentiles. Okay? So we have them, in an odd sort of sense, we have them to thank. Okay? Now, the salvation that has come to the Gentiles is the report of eternal salvation by Jesus Christ and the opportunity for temporal salvation by believing that report. That's what's come to the Gentiles. Chapter 10, remember, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. We're talking about temporal salvation there, not eternal. And since they stumbled, God came to the Gentiles, giving the Gentiles the opportunity for that same salvation. The elect Gentiles now have the same opportunity that the Jews had for temporal salvation because of their stumbling. And these Jews stumbled and fell over Jesus Christ because they didn't believe the gospel. And if you've done much witnessing to people that if you could see inside of them, you would swear that they were probably elect, and yet they don't want to hear it. You ever had any of that? Ever talked to anybody like that? Yeah, we all have. Well, that's what Paul's dealing with. We're just putting it under this heading of he's talking about Jews, that's all. Okay, but the same type of situation applies. You go out and talk to somebody that grew up in some other church that is just going to hang on to that doctrine forever, even though they look like a Christian, they live like a Christian, they don't cheat people, they don't steal from people, they don't lie to people. They for all intents and purposes, they live as good of a life as you do, maybe even better in some senses, but they're not going to listen to you because what you're saying is not what they grew up with. Well, that's what Paul's dealing with here. He's got these people that have for all their lives believed that Judaism is the way, and they're not going to pay attention, they're not going to listen. Okay? That's why it bothered him so much. So I hope that helps. Now, they fell over Christ. Look at Romans chapter 9, verses 32 through 33. Wherefore, because they sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law, for they stumbled at that stumbling stone. If you've been raised your entire life to believe that the way you get to heaven is by keeping the commandments, and you've heard it from the time that you were 2 years old until now you're 65, and that's all you've ever heard, and that's what it looks like to you from the verses that the people have used to you, it's hard to then say, wait a minute, they're wrong. This is one of the hard parts that we all have to struggle with at times, when we start to see that somebody lied to us. Somewhere along the way, somebody told us something that wasn't true. Maybe it was a mother and a father. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe it was, the the old gray-haired pastor that we had for all those years that we thought so much of. And then you come to a realization that's not really the way it is. Most people aren't willing to go through that exercise. They just aren't. It's easier just to stay where you are than it is to struggle and fight your way out of there. And that's what Paul's dealing with. Okay? They sought it not by faith, but as it were by the works of the law. For they stumbled at that stumbling stone, as it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and whosoever believeth on him shall not be ashamed. Look at Isaiah chapter 8. Verses 14 and 15. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and be snared and be taken. You know, there was a time when the guy got over, I don't want to say his name, but when the guy got a hold of me at the very beginning and sent tapes to Wendy and I told you before, I sent them on my stereo. And they sat there for, I don't know, a month maybe, before I even bothered to take them. I could very well have just left them on the stereo. I could have never listened to them at all. And the same could go for a lot of you. When somebody approached you and you said, that's kind of crazy talk, that doesn't line up. It would have been very easy just to not stick them in the radio and listen to them, right? Well, that's what we're talking about. Most people aren't going to pick them up off the stereo. They're going to leave them on the stereo because they understand enough to realize that if this is right, it's going to rock my world and it's going to make a lot of changes. And I'm going to have to go through some stuff that I just as soon would rather not go through. And so it applies in our case just like it applied in Paul's case back then. And that's really what he was dealing with. And these people, they stumbled over the top of this. The first time that I heard that, because I grew up a Baptist, a missionary Baptist, and the conversation that I was having was that I believed that salvation was by grace, but you still had to believe. I was one of those guys, that it was by grace through my faith. And the first conversation I had in which I was told that that was of works, I thought the guy was nuts. I could have very easily stopped right there and been done. A lot of us could have very easily stopped right at that point and been done with it. When I first came home and told Wendy that I think he's right and Wendy was not happy with it, I could have thrown it away then and been like these guys that Paul's talking about. And every one of us has gone through that. Every one of us at one point or another has said to ourselves, you know what, I don't know if it's worth this. I don't know if it's worth the cost. I don't know. I remember somebody used to sit in the back row that asked me what the cost was. You know, I don't know if it's worth it or not. Don't know if it's worth the cost. And that's what Paul was having to deal with. Matthew chapter 21, verses 42 through 44. Jesus saith unto them, Did ye never read in the Scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, the same has become the head of the corner? This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say unto you, the kingdom of God shall be taken from you and given to a nation bringing forth the fruits thereof. There's a promise by God manifest in the flesh that national Israel was going to be over with and it was going to be given to somebody else. And whosoever shall fall on this stone shall be broken, but on whomsoever it shall fall, it will grind him to powder. And when the chief priests and Pharisees had heard his parables, they perceived that he spake of them. Why, they wanted to kill him. But these Jews, they stumbled over this. They couldn't get past that. Now, the gospel of salvation by Christ went to the Jew first. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. And look at Acts chapter 13. And verse 26. Men and brethren, children of the stock of Abraham, and whosoever among you feareth God, to you is the word of this salvation sent. Went to the Jew first. That's where it went first. And the Jews stumbled over it and rejected it. And so then the message went to the Gentiles. Same chapter, Acts 13. Look at 45 through 47. But when the Jews saw the multitude, they were filled with envy, and spake against those things which were spoken by Paul, contradicting and blaspheming. Then Paul and Barnabas waxed bold, and said it was necessary that the word of God should first have been spoken to you. But seeing ye put it from you, and judge yourselves unworthy of everlasting life, lo, we turn to the Gentiles. For so hath the Lord commanded us, saying, I have set thee to be a light of the Gentiles, that thou shouldest be for salvation unto the ends of the earth. And look also at Acts chapter 28 and verse 28. Let's go back a little bit just to get the context here. Look at verse 23. And when they had appointed him a day, there came many to him into his lodging, to whom he expounded and testified the kingdom of God, persuading them concerning Jesus, both out of the law of Moses and out of the prophets, from morning till evening. And some believed the things which were spoken, and some believed not. And when they agreed not among themselves, they departed. After that Paul had spoken one word, well spake the Holy Ghost by Isaiah the prophet unto the fathers, saying unto this people, saying, Go unto this people, and say, Hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see, and not perceive. For the heart of this people is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. Be it known therefore unto you that the salvation of God is sent unto the Gentiles, and that they will hear it. So the message was sent to the Jews first, and the Jews rejected it, and so it went to the Gentiles. And that's a good place to jump off for this morning. We'll pick this back up again. Now, I'll be gone next week in Las Vegas, but when we come back again, then we'll pick up here and move forward. I'm not sure. I would think maybe 1 week, maybe 2 weeks on 11, and then we'll start to get into the practical teaching in chapter 12. So with that, I thank you this morning for your very kind and patient attention. Let's stand to be dismissed in prayer.